and I'm so happy to welcome Virginia De Martin to our session tonight. Virginia will present herself, but I can just I noticed today that you're the chair of the women's subcommittee, which I'm also a part of. So that was something I discovered today, actually. But I'm last year on this camp, we had Guro Strøm Solli and Vegard Rasdal telling about the science in Nordic combined, and especially with the female athletes. And Virginia will tell us more about this topic today. So I don't think I'm going to say anything more. I will let Virginia take us through this, and I'm really looking forward to hear your about the new science in regarding women and developing in sports.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you for the invitation also to the Lillehammer Olympic Legacy Sports Center. I'm gonna start first sharing my screen. Just let me know if there's something weird, but we should. Is it okay?
This looks really nice.
Perfect. Okay, so then we can get started. So as you can see from this title, we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle and the menstrual cycle in sport, because I guess athletes and coaches here are interested in that. And I purposefully used this title, Women's Superpower. And many of you might think, oh my gosh, what is she saying? The menstrual cycle is just a hustle. And of course, sometimes it is, because the period might be a hustle. Someone has a very strong and severe side effects, especially during the period. And then also sometimes we have some days that we just want to cry. And yeah, so there's a lot going on with the menstrual cycle to make it as a hustle. But at the same time, I really do believe that with the right support, with the right knowledge, we can turn the table upside down and really make it an advantage for us. And I'm going to share also a little bit what research says on this. So first, a couple of words about me. I'm a former athlete. I competed in cross-country skiing until 2019, and then I decided that I wanted to continue with my studies. So I studied my master in Trondheim in Norway. And I chose this topic for my master thesis, and now I'm following up this project as I'm working as a research assistant at the Center for Elite Sports Research in Trondheim, because I experienced on my skin how it is to have a menstrual cycle and being an athlete and all the challenges connected with that. So I thought, okay, it might not be have been ideal how I dealt with that and how my coaches dealt with that back then, but maybe I can do something useful now for the athletes of the future. So a little bit of overview about what this speech will be about. So first of all, we're going to cover the women participants in exercise research, and a little bit of background on the menstrual cycle in order to be all on the same level and try to understand what's going on. And then I'm going to share our preliminary results on the study that I'm working on right now, which is part of a very big study that is quite famous at the moment in Norway, and is called Fendura, the female endurance athlete. And then I would like to try at least to give you some practical suggestions and end with some final considerations. So let's get started. When we talk about women in sport, I like the idea of shrink it and pink it, which means that historically women has been treated as a small man, and all the knowledge that has been acquired on men has been applied to females. But this might not be the case, because actually we are not just a small man. We are quite different, and the same knowledge cannot be applied. And to bring up some data, there is a research that came out a few years ago and found out that only slightly more than 30% of the participants in sports and exercise medicine journals were females. And if we count the articles including only women, they were, of course, also less than that. So we don't have, there is like a important knowledge gap on females, especially when it comes down to sport. But what is this difference? Well, there are quite many differences, of course, but a very important one is about the sex hormones. And whereas in males, the most important hormone is testosterone, in females, the concentration of estrogen and progesterone are higher. And a second difference is, whereas the levels of testosterone are quite consistent from day to day, estrogen and progesterone fluctuate quite a lot on a cycle that lasts between 21 and 35 days. And this cycle is the menstrual cycle. But what do these hormones do actually? Well, their role goes way beyond than reproduction, which is, of course, their first role. We can find the receptors for these hormones in various tissues of our body, and muscle included. So when we train, those hormones are implicated, and also they have different effects on our body, on our muscles, on our physiology. For example, estrogen is thought to have a stabilizing effect on muscle cells and improve anti-inflammatory processes, whereas progesterone has counteracting effect. So it means that when progesterone is high, it might downregulate the effects of estrogen, and also has a catabolic effect. And here is our picture of the menstrual cycle, and we can divide the menstrual cycle mainly in two phases, which are the first one from the beginning of the menstrual cycle, which is at the beginning of the period, the menstruations, till the ovulation, and this is the follicular phase. And the second phase is the luteal phase. And then within these two big phases, we can identify other phases. So the first one is the early follicular phase, that you see here in red with the sign EF, and is a phase in which both estrogen and progesterone's concentrations are low. Throughout the follicular phase, estrogen starts to rise and reaches a peak right before the ovulation, whereas progesterone remains low. This phase is called, as you can see, LF, late follicular phase, and precedes ovulation, because this peak in estrogen triggers another hormone that is not depicted here, and is a luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that makes the egg to be released. Right after, we have the ovulatory phase, and in this phase, estrogen drops down, whereas progesterone starts again to rise. And right in the middle of the luteal phase, we have what is called, of course, mid-luteal phase, which is a phase in which progesterone is at its maximum level, and there is a second peak in estrogen. So based on the different concentrations of hormones, we can identify those different phases. And of course, it's because these different concentration of estrogen and progesterone can have different effects. But as I wrote here, this is an idealized 28-day cycle, but it's not always the case. For example, if you can see, as you can see here, in the panel A, you can see a normal ovulatory cycle. So you see estrogen picking up right before ovulation and then dropping and picking up a second time, and then progesterone reaching a peak in the mid-luteal phase. Whereas if you see panel B, is oligomenorrheic cycle, which means that is a cycle that has a length of more than 35 days. And as you see, the luteal phase is shortened, and the follicular phase is longer than usual, and the peak in estrogen is a bit delayed. And the panel C and D, you can see two examples of amenorrheic cycles. Amenorrheic cycle means that there are no menstruations, so no fluctuations in hormones, and no ovulation, and no period. And of course, there is another, let's say, problem, but another card that is making a mess, and the use of hormonal contraceptives, which is quite, there is quite an important proportion of athletes that use hormonal contraceptives. Actually, a recent study by Guro Stromsoli showed that about 60% of athletes use hormonal contraceptives. And what happens with hormonal contraceptives is that the pills that we take, there are different kinds, but usually, let's say, the pill that we take down-regulates our endogenous hormones and replace them with the exogenous hormones. It might be that hormonal contraceptives have an influence on training and performance, but we are not sure. There is, as I cited here, a recent paper about that, but it seems like the effect is so small that it is not possible to draw conclusions. But anyways, it is something that we have to take into account. And here, why understanding all these things about the menstrual cycle and hormonal contraceptives is so important? First of all, the menstrual cycle can be a very important sign of health. So, for example, if we have a normal menstrual cycle length, if we have regular menstruations, ovulation, this is saying to us that all our or most of our physiological functions are working properly. So it's a very useful sign. It's a very useful mechanism for females to know that they are healthy if we know how to interpret these signs. And also, the menstrual cycle could impact our training, our recovery, our performance. So it's very important to know which phase are we going through, or if there is any abnormality or whatever. And also, if we understand how to train with our menstrual cycle, it could give us performance advantages. And what do we know about the effect of the different phases of the menstrual cycle? So it's quite clear that they influence physiology. For example, body temperature and heart rate and ventilation are higher in the mid-luteal phase. Of course, I'm talking about normal hormone fluctuations, which is not always the case, as we've seen. A recent paper that came out in 2020 showed that it might trivially influence performance. The early follicular phase, females can experience a lower performance, but it trivially means that is so small that it is almost nothing. So we cannot say anything about that yet. And it seems also like that muscle damage and inflammatory processes are enhanced in the follicular phase, especially in the early follicular phase. And this is because the levels of estrogen are lower in this phase. And also there are research that shows that it can alter training strain, monotony. It might also alter and influence the pacing strategies. But there's a but, or better, many, because most of the available research is of poor quality. So now there is a 3-step method that is proposed whenever we want to test the female participants in research, and it means that we have to identify the menstrual cycle phases with 3 steps. And the first one is the calendar counted method. So we have to count how many days our menstrual cycle is, when the period is, and so on. The second one is using an ovulation test and determining exactly when the ovulation happens. And then based on that, we can also determine when the mid-luteal phase happens, which is normally 7 to 9 days. And the third step is a verification. So we have to take a venous blood sample in every phase that we want to test and confirm that the concentration level of estrogen and progesterone is what it should be in that phase, to be sure. And of course, this is very costly, is time consuming, and it's not easy to find many participants willing to do so. So that's why most of the available research does not comply with all these requirements. And also we have quite many contrasting results. There are very few studies on elite athletes because, of course, there are not that many elite athletes at all, but at the same time also they are busy, they want to train and compete, and they don't want to spend time in research, or better, not many of them. Also, there is a large intra and inter-individual variability, so between two different persons, but also within the same person and between two different and maybe consecutive menstrual cycles, which makes it even more complicated. And as I said already, approximately 60% of athletes use hormonal contraceptives. What does it mean? This means that we cannot draw any consistent guidelines at the moment. And now I'm gonna talk a little bit of our pilot study and show you our preliminary results. And we investigated objective and subjective recovery measures among endurance athletes. So what we've done, we've recruited, at least in the first part of the study, we now have more, 15 female athletes. They were competing in training and competing in 4 different endurance sports, and we followed them up for a 3-month period in which they have a different number of menstrual cycles. And we asked them to record daily their resting heart rate, so when they woke up in the morning, to rate their subjective sleep quality, physical and mental readiness to train, and of course to record their training. Everything has been done on online training diaries. And we also asked them to perform an ovulation test. And what we found out was that resting heart rate seemed not to be influenced by the menstrual cycle phase, which was a little bit surprising as we expected to have a higher resting heart rate during the mid-luteal phase. Subjective sleep quality was significantly lower in ovulatory and mid-luteal phase compared to the early follicular phase. And also readiness to train, both physical and mental, was decreased in the mid-luteal phase. And another important finding was that side effects were associated with the poorer mental readiness to train. And this was an additional finding that was quite, let's say, worrisome and important. So that's why we reported that as well. Despite most of our participants had a regular menstrual cycle, most of them had an ovulatory cycle, which means that even though we have a regular menstrual cycle length, our menstrual cycle might not be totally healthy. And the practical applications from this study, at least the preliminary results, are that it's important to account for the menstrual cycle also when we want to monitor recovery, because the menstrual cycle is having an effect on the measures that we want to use to monitor our recovery from training. And it's important to take into account also the differences in menstrual cycle characteristics. So, for example, different hormonal fluctuations and differences between menstrual cycles and so on. And also, it's important to consider the menstrual cycles related side effects. So how we perceive, for example, in the first days of our period when these side effects are so high. This also has an effect on the measures of recovery. And it's important also to monitor mood, for example, with the mental readiness to train, because this has been found to be associated with altered power output, which means that we cannot perform as we did usually. And also there is a link between menstrual irregularities and recovery. A recent paper by Schall and al. Showed that under-recovered condition is linked to abnormal ovarian function, which is also linked to low energy availability. But this is maybe a topic for another time. And so what should we do then with this menstrual cycle? We don't have these many guidelines, and we don't have these robust fundings, but still there's something that we can do. And as an athlete, I would suggest to first of all try to understand your own menstrual cycle and understand what is a regular menstrual cycle. And here are like some simple signs. For example, when you had your first period, what's the length between your periods, and how many days your bleeding phase lasts. And this is maybe takes a little bit more time and effort to perform an ovulation test, but in some cases can be actually useful. And how to do that? Well, nowadays it's quite simple because there are many apps. I think probably the most famous one is Clue, but also Fitter Woman. There are many. And actually, at the moment, at the Center for Elite Sports Research, we are piloting a new app that is designed for athletes. So stay tuned. This is going to be quite cool. But also you can use paper or a calendar, whatever. And what to track down. So, of course, when your period is starting, when your bleeding phase is starting and ending every month, which kind of side effects you have. For example, if you feel bloated, if you have a back pain, headache, and also how heavy is your blood flow, but also some positive changes. For example, some days you feel way more energized than usual, more sharp. And yeah, this could be also important. And with the time, you will see that there are actually some patterns, some recurrent patterns. And also, of course, might be very useful for athletes to track changes in training, recovery, and performance. And also, what to do as a coach. So I would like to think about this in like concentric cycles, and we can go deeper and deeper. But every cycle, every step needs the preceding one to be in place. And the first one, which is very simple, I mean, it's not exactly super simple, but can be at least simpler than the others, is to create an environment which allows everyone, so both athletes, coaches, supporting staff, to talk openly about the menstrual cycle. In this step, I would suggest that some basic education about it can really help it, and try to discuss about it. I know that it can be awkward and embarrassing, maybe sometimes, especially with young athletes, and especially if maybe the athlete is not the same gender as the coach. But I think it's really worth it, and it's really worth the effort. And then the second step, start to investigate. So just gather some general information about the athlete's menstrual cycle. Do they have a regular menstrual cycle? Are they followed up by a gynecologist? And if we notice something that is a little bit abnormal, just refer them to the doctor. If you're not a doctor, you cannot say your cycle is abnormal, but maybe refer to their doctor. And we go on to the third step, which is a little bit more, it requires a little bit more action, and athletes can start to track their menstrual cycle. And as we said, related side effects, but also positive changes in training performance. And they can talk with their coach about that. And then the final step, which is of course quite difficult to put in place at the moment, since we don't have clear and scientific robust guidelines, but still hopefully will be in the near future, is to tailor the training program based on the menstrual cycle. For example, when we're talking about endurance training, we basically don't have any robust research on that to say it's better to focus on volume in this phase or on hits in this phase. But when we're talking, for example, about strength training, there are quite important and robust research papers out there saying that focusing in specific menstrual cycle phases on more volume and more training in terms of strength can give considerable gains. So this is something to take into account maybe for the future, when we from the research side will have something more specific. And before concluding, some final considerations. So first of all, in order to provide you with robust guidelines, we need to perform more research and high quality research, and we cannot perform research on, like, let's say, a regular population and then apply it to elite athletes, because elite athletes work differently. So we really need your help. We need eager athletes and supportive coaches to do so. And second, I want to say something that it might be a little bit provocative, but yeah, maybe provoking some discussions and thoughts. And I'm a little bit skeptical on the fact that the sport system, how is it built at the moment, is right for women and to ensure their health and development. Because actually, most of the cases when women start to have their period, so around like 12 or 14 years old, they might experience some a plateau in their performance, but this does not mean that they are done as athletes, because they have just a different pattern compared to males. So I'm not sure if the system as it is now, with very early qualification processes, is right to ensure that women will continue in sport and at the same time preserving their health. And if you got interested in the topic and you're in Norway and keen to contribute, we are still looking for participants in a couple of studies that are part of this big study, Fendura. So just feel free to reach out to me, and we will be extremely happy to have you on board. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Virginia. This was really interesting. From my point of view, I think this was really interesting, and I also think that this is extremely important for everyone involved in sports, and especially for us in Nordic Combined, which is regarding that we are so new to the sport and have the girls at the top level. So hopefully this was interesting for everyone who has been listening as well. I know, Virginia, that you will take questions from both the athletes and the coaches. So if anyone would like to share some thoughts or have any questions for Virginia, feel free to ask them now. I will stop the recording now so that so then you can ask the question afterwards.